Hi, I'm Ben from thePinkLens.com and welcome to this, my full history of LGBT cinema in the UK. Obviously there are thousands of LGBT films that have been released over the years, but I'm going to be taking a look at it from a distinctly British perspective, seeing which films have made an impact in the UK, from before Stonewall right the way through to the present day.
Hey, Ennis, do you know somebody named Jack?
Welcome, welcome, welcome. Looks like we got you just in time.
What kind of cabaret do you do?
We dress up in women's clothes and parade around mouthing the words to other people's songs.
So what do you do around here?
Read books, transcribe music.
Hey, Mikey, how long have I been here on the streets, on this crusade?
My name is Harvey Milk, and I'm here to recruit you.
Because this case is not just about AIDS, is it? So let's talk about what this case is really all about. General public's hatred, our loathing, our fear of homosexuals.
Come on, gentlemen, come this way. Come on.
What are you doing?
Get out of the car.
Can I call you back?
Dear Blue, I'm just like you.
Men only. Oh, don't be daft. We want to see everything, even the repasy.
You must promise me that there's not going to be any drama.
I promise, I promise.
Look at me in my eyes and promise.
I promise no drama, Alexandra.
Whoa!
Dearest, there are no accidents, and no explanation I offer will satisfy you.
I like the hat.
Stonewall was in 1969, but the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in the UK happened in 1967. Arguments for gay rights had been levelled for over a decade, but came to a head with the Wolfenden Report in 1965 and Conservative peer Lord Arran, who then championed it through the Lords until it was written into UK law. The US followed suit 2 years later, but it would take several years before cinema would start positively depicting the stories of queer people on screen. Until this point, the depiction of LGBT people on screen in mainstream Hollywood was controlled by something called the Hays Code. And the Hays Code was a system of rules that stopped people from putting things on film that were considered to be immoral, and that included homosexuality. However, in order to get round the censors, some people and some filmmakers managed to put coded references to LGBT people on screen. For example, in films like Morocco in 1930, Rebel Without a Cause, and Some Like It Hot. And in films like these, LGBT people are quite prominently on screen, but it's never actually explicitly stated that they're LGBT. Instead, it's just hinted at, and as a result we get characters who LGBT people would understand are one of them, but maybe not everybody else. Meanwhile, some LGBT people were being depicted as villains, as criminals, as psychopaths. In films like Advice and Consent and Compulsion and Rebecca, LGBT people were seen as terrible villains who were there to corrupt you and there to destroy your lives. And let's just talk about villainous, murderous lesbians for a second. If you think about the film The Children's Hour from 1962, starring Shirley MacLaine and Audrey Hepburn, they play a pair of school teachers who are accused of, shock horror, being lesbians. And when it actually comes out the fact that actually they are lesbians, the two of them are so disgusted and revolted in themselves that they cannot continue with being teachers or just generally living. And on screen, lesbianism, as well as homosexuality in men, was shown as something truly, truly repulsive that people should be ashamed of.
Did she sense it? But you know, it could have been any lie. She was looking for anything to... But why this lie? She found the lie with the ounce of truth. Don't you see? I can't stand to have you touch me. I can't stand to have you look at me.
Elsewhere, LGBT people found themselves the victim, in some cases, of blackmail. Blackmailed by people who had discovered their sexuality and were threatening to expose it to their family and employers. And this started to trickle through. These stories started to appear on screen, particularly in films like Victim in 1961, starring Dirk Bogarde, in which a man, a sympathetic man, a man that the audience can understand and relate to, is being blackmailed for his homosexuality. But even though some depictions of gay people were sympathetic, in general, LGBT people were seen as something horrible, as a pariah. You've only got to watch The Killing of Sister George from 1968 to see that even though they were depicting a lesbian story on screen, she was seen as predatory, as perverted, as somebody who should be avoided and somebody who was dangerous to be around. There's also now the very outdated stereotype of the sissy, the highly effeminate gentleman who appears on screen as a sidekick of some sort, as a supporting character, and is seen as somebody who is, yes, funny, but on the other hand has quite a dark side to their personality. You've only got to watch All About Eve to see a perfect example of the sissy on film. So with all these negative stereotypes and negative tropes that were circulating around in Hollywood, where was the positivity? Where were the positive representations of LGBT people? Well, the answer is not in Hollywood. One thing that certainly wasn't being depicted on screen at this point was a sexualized version of homosexuality. Erotica had been being made ever since the invention of the movie camera, but one person who was making some interesting erotica at this point was Kenneth Anger. Kenneth Anger had been making his erotic movies since the 1940s. Films like Fireworks and Scorpio Rising feature images that have become iconic within the LGBT community. The leather-clad bikers, the handlebar moustaches, the muscle-bound Adonises that would later come to influence things like Tom of Finland and the idealised version of what masculinity was. And erotica was being made behind closed doors and was being seen by a select few. Meanwhile, in France, a very influential French novelist, Jean Genet, made the one film that he would ever make in his career. Un Chant d'Amour was an erotic film in the same style and the same genre as Kenneth Anger. However, his one was seen. Suddenly, people start to see this, and it starts to trickle out. It goes to the UK, it goes to the USA, and it starts to influence what people are starting to see, and it starts to shape what gay erotica would look like until the present day. France wasn't the only country where being gay wasn't illegal. In 1966, Ingmar Bergman, the legendary Swedish film director, created his masterpiece Persona, which features a relationship between two women. It was lauded worldwide as being a masterpiece and was applauded for its aesthetic value. In Italy, directors like Federico Fellini and Pier Paolo Pasolini were able to create films that featured LGBT characters because of the fact that being gay had been legal in Italy since 1890. And meanwhile, in Japan, films like Funeral Parade of Roses were able to be made because being gay had been legal there since 1880. But while the people and the politicians of the US and the UK were a little bit slow on the uptake in following behind its European and Asian counterparts, the artistic community was leading by example. Andy Warhol in 1965 made My Hustler, a quasi-reality TV style documentary which followed a group of gay men around as they were obsessed with a gay hustler called Paul America, and this was made in 1965. And we see then scenes from Fire Island Pines, scenes that would later become synonymous with the gay community, happening in 1965, evident of the fact that there was a gay community that was alive and well, and that people were able to survive being gay in the United States. You've only got to watch the documentary before Stonewall to see that there was indeed a gay community that existed at the same time that all of this repression was going on. However, when we do look back at this period before the decriminalisation of homosexuality, the stories that we hear are stories of people whose lives were ruined by the fact that they were gay, who were forced into the closet and had to stay hidden. Then in 1969, when Stonewall happened, suddenly everything changed. With homosexuality legal across the Western world, suddenly LGBT people had a voice. And these voices were starting to filter through on screen as early as in 1969, the year of Stonewall. That year, Midnight Cowboy won Best Picture at the Oscars, and it featured a hustler who had sex with men in it. And actually, it was the last film that featured gay issues or gay characters in any way to win Best Picture until Moonlight took home the Best Picture prize in 2017. It's 1970. The Stonewall riots have led to the decriminalisation of homosexuality in the USA. It's been legal in the UK for 3 years, and Boys in the Band is currently in the cinema. This situational comedy depicts the lives, loves and struggles of a group of wholly gay men. And what's striking now, looking back on it, is just how similar they were then to the way that we behave today. Despite being released in the year after Stonewall, already there are the stereotypes of the grinder tribes of today. The beefcake, the catty queen, and the gay man who is damaged by his past rejections.
You remind me of an old maid school teacher.
You remind me of a chicken wing.
I'm sure you meant that as a compliment.
And besides, I want to get to the bars by midnight.
He's a class act all the way around.
What do you mean get to the bars? Sweetie, I paid you for the whole evening, remember?
Oh, I hurt my back doing my exercises, and I want to get to bed early today.
In the years that followed Stonewall, the LGBT community would go down two main paths. The first was to continue to fight for their freedoms, and the second was to wholly take advantage of the freedoms that they already had. Queer cinema would reflect more of the latter, but as people were attending the very first Pride marches and coming out of the closet in their droves, queer cinema reflected their continuing struggle. After the huge success of Love Story in 1970, a gay version of the film emerged in 1974 called A Very Natural Thing, which went so far as to paraphrase the dialogue from the original film and, despite being panned by critics, was the first gay film to get a multiplex release across the US. Meanwhile, in the UK, the huge success of The Naked Civil Servant, the biopic of notorious society figure Quentin Crisp, saw John Hurt win a BAFTA in 1975 for the hugely popular role that depicted the struggles Crisp had in the years before he could legally be gay and express who he was.
I dream of a great dark man, a real man, enormously strong, enormously virile, whose love I shall win. I know that my dream is doomed to disappointment. If I succeed, I fail. If I win the love of a man, he cannot be a real man, and the more feminine I make myself to attract a real man, the less will a real man be attracted by me.
In the UK, where camp figures such as Kenneth Williams and Frankie Howard had been celebrated but disconnected from their sexuality, this sexualisation of camp figures was a huge step. Another person who was protesting against the system was John Waters. With his now iconic Pink Flamingos debuting in 1972, his collaborations with drag star Divine and unique brand of gross-out comedy were deliberately provocative. For the next 2 decades, Waters would be courting controversy with films that sat somewhere between kitsch and extreme bad taste.
Connie and Raymond Marble, you have breathed your last breath. You have sighed your last sigh.
Similarly, Fellini and Pasolini in Italy were creating films that knowingly pushed boundaries. Satyricon, The Canterbury Tales, Arabian Nights, and most controversially, Salò, or The 120 Days of Sodom, in which a group of fascists round up a group of nubile boys and girls and subject them to 120 days of physical torture. For many, these kinds of depictions of LGBT people on screen was counterproductive. How were they meant to make the LGBT lifestyle more palatable for non-LGBT people if queer culture was flagrantly doing everything that it could to be contentious? The Rocky Horror Picture Show portrayed transvestism as something dark and sexualised. Rainer Werner Fassbinder released unsettling character dramas like The Bitter Tears of Petra Van Kant. Derek Jarman embraced blasphemous eroticism in Sebastian and punk counterculture in Jubilee. And all the while, gay men are identifying more and more with hypermasculinity, holding Tom of Finland as probably their biggest gay icon of the 1970s. And with gay pornography now legal, gay erotica is less artistic and more intended simply for titillation, with only the works of Peter de Rome and Pink Narcissus being remembered for that aesthetic merit. While all of these films are being made on the art house scene, what about the mainstream? Well, in 1978, France produced La Cage aux Faux, a high-camp farce that revolved around a gay couple and their son who wants to introduce his parents to his fiancée's ultra-conservative family. With one of his dads so camp that he couldn't possibly be mistaken for heterosexual, they decide it's better for him to masquerade as a woman instead, after which much farcical hilarity ensues. The film was a massive commercial success both at home and abroad, spawned a musical stage show, and would eventually be remade in Hollywood as The Birdcage. Italy also saw LGBT characters filtering into its mainstream, with films like A Special Day and Conversation Piece becoming big international hits abroad. But what about what was going on in Hollywood? With the Hays Code officially lifted in 1968, US cinema was veering away from melodramatic glamour and more toward gritty realism. In 1975, Al Pacino starred in Dog Day Afternoon. a true story about a bank robbery that turns sour. As part of the negotiations with police, his wife is brought in to assist them, except his wife is a transgender woman, and it transpires that his motive for robbing the bank is to fund her sex reassignment surgery.
Well, I couldn't explain the things I did. So I went to a psychiatrist who told me that I was a woman trapped in a man's body.
In 1978, Midnight Express depicted a man imprisoned in Turkey for drug smuggling, and while there, engaged in same-sex sexual activity in prison. Both these films received awards attention, but not as much as Cabaret in 1972, which featured gay and bisexual characters and, had it been released any other year, probably would have won Best Picture at the Oscars. But unfortunately, it was released in the same year as The Godfather, so it missed out. By the end of the 70s, LGBT people were being seen on screen openly for the very first time. And while not all of these depictions were wholly positive, the tide had definitely turned. LGBT people were experiencing sexual liberation. You only have to watch the documentary Gay Sex in the 70s to see how people were having their cake, eating it too, then going to the candy shop and eating everything within sight. Soho had become a regular haunt for gay men. San Francisco was a gay mecca with the rise of Harvey Milk to public office. Fire Island was the gay paradise on Earth. By the end of the decade, everything seemed to be going so brilliantly for LGBT people, but then, in 1980, a now notorious film named Cruising was released. In it, Al Pacino starred as a police detective enlisted to try and catch a serial killer targeting the gay leather scene. The excesses of what appears on screen as a debauched and depraved world was reminiscent of pre-Stonewall attitudes to LGBT people.
There's just stuff going down. I don't think I can deal with it.
But while protesters objected vehemently to the movie and the message that it held, it marked the end of the halcyon days of the 70s, because it wouldn't be very long before everything changed for the LGBT community and the public's attitude toward them, with the arrival of a mysterious disease which would later become known as AIDS. The 70s had been a decade of decadence for LGBT people. With their newfound liberation, separatism had flourished. Radical feminism was growing in popularity, while the newly legal bathhouses and sex clubs were becoming a normalised part of being a gay man. But while everybody else in the Western world started the 1980s with a period of wealth and stability, the tide changed very quickly for LGBT people. Initially, it was business as usual. Campy comedies like Tootsie and Victor Victoria celebrated queerness and flamboyance, albeit through the safety of a heteronormative lens. Fassbender made his most iconic movie, Carrel, in which a Belgian sailor engages in a whole plethora of sexual depravity in the French town of Brest, shot like a Technicolor 50s thriller on luscious but stylised film sets. But Carrel proved to be his final film, with the controversial German director dying of a drug overdose in 1982. The death of the man who was probably the world's most famous gay filmmaker coincided with the first reported cases of gay cancer, the disease that would later become known as AIDS. While the gay community were quick to realise that they were at the start of what would become an international pandemic, the straight media, politicians and public were slow to follow suit. With the disease suddenly branding gay men as social pariahs, it can be no coincidence that films that featured gay men suddenly started to disappear from film screens, with only really the Brazilian film Kiss of the Spider Woman making any real impact for the next few years. During this period, however, films that featured lesbian stories were beginning to become commercial successes. In some, the lesbian stories were played down, like The Colour Purple and later Fried Green Tomatoes, but in others, their depictions were positioned front and centre. From the deep south romanticism of Desert Hearts to the bristling sexual tension of Personal Best. Thrillers like The Hunger and Basic Instinct would sexualise lesbian sex for a heterosexual male audience, but some of Hollywood's new generation of leading ladies would even step up to playing lesbian roles, like Uma Thurman in Even Cowgirls Get the Blues. It would take a few years for the public panic about HIV and AIDS to reach the UK, and with Derek Jarman now established as one of the country's biggest directors, gay stories were being told on screen. While the gay director retrospectively outed painter Caravaggio and England's King Edward II in his punk biopics, Merchant Ivory tackled E.M. Forster's gay period drama Maurice, and Rupert Everett starred in Another Country, the biopic of Guy Burgess, who would become one of the Cambridge spies and was also gay. Elsewhere, Gary Oldman starred as Joe Orton opposite Alfred Molina in Prick Up Your Ears, the story of the renowned British playwright who was murdered by his male partner.
Currently, I am working on a screenplay for 4 boys who are nagging Jesus Christ for the position of #1 most famous person ever. No. These are normal, healthy boys. Oh, but they're all very pretty.
By the sea, by the sea, by the beautiful sea, you and me, oh, happy with me.
And later, gender-bending historical odyssey Orlando saw Tilda Swinton step into the limelight as a champion for LGBT rights after the diagnosis and rapid decline of her longtime collaborator Jarman. Most significantly, 2 of the biggest LGBT films of the period would come from the UK. My Beautiful Laundrette saw Daniel Day-Lewis star as a young member of a skinhead gang who falls in love with a young Pakistani man living in London.
Why don't people like laundrettes? Because they're like toilets. This could be a Ritz among laundrettes.
A laundrette as big as the Ritz. Oh, yes.
While director Neil Jordan made The Crying Game, a romance that explores gender against the backdrop of the IRA.
No way.
You said anything, Dale.
Girl has to draw the line somewhere.
I want to change you to a man.
Why?
It's a secret.
Back in Hollywood, the AIDS crisis was seeing scores of stars being forced out of the closet because it became increasingly clear that they were suffering and dying of AIDS. Hollywood heartthrob Rock Hudson, Psycho star Anthony Perkins, eccentric piano megastar Liberace, Carell himself, Brad Davis, and countless others would be slain by the disease, as well as French philosopher and film theorist Michel Foucault. The disease would first appear on screen in TV movie An Early Frost in 1985, but then significantly in Parting Glances, in which newcomer Steve Buscemi played a young man dying of the disease while his friends struggled to deal with his oncoming death. While movies like The Thing depicted HIV and AIDS in a metaphorical way, it took until 1989 for Hollywood to stop depicting it as a plague-like punishment and start being sympathetic towards people with AIDS. Longtime Companion depicted AIDS from the perspective of a group of gay men for the first time, to much acclaim, and earned Bruce Davison an Oscar nomination.
We've been given your name as a contact for John Deacon. Your friend has pneumonia. He has a high fever.
How high?
105. Then they don't even tell him what they've told me and David.
I'm so sorry.
It's just not fair. It's not fair.
Then, the adaptation of Randy Schultz's novelisation of the early days of the crisis, And the Band Played On, was adapted into a movie with an all-star cast, before AIDS finally got the full Hollywood treatment with Jonathan Demme's Philadelphia, which would win Tom Hanks an Oscar. The year previously, Demme came under great criticism from the LGBT community for depicting the killer in The Silence of the Lambs as trans. Accused of depicting LGBT people in a negative light, his response was Philadelphia, a movie that depicted the injustices surrounding a man fired from his job for having AIDS. Although the film positions itself from a heterosexual perspective, looking in on the LGBT community, it was still a definitive landmark moment for queer cinema, which saw both gay people and people with AIDS embraced by the mainstream for the very first time.
Everybody in this courtroom is thinking about sexual orientation, sexual preference, whatever you want to call it. Who does what to whom and how they do it. I mean, they're looking at Andrew Beckett. They're thinking about it. They're looking at Mr. Wheeler, Miss Conine, even you, Your Honor. They're wondering about it. Trust me, I know that they are looking at me and thinking about it. So let's just get it out in the open. Let's get it out of the closet. Because this case is not just about AIDS, is it? So let's talk about what this case is really all about. The general public's hatred, our loathing, our fear of homosexuals.
It was around this time that the tide began to change for people suffering from the disease. Medication had improved, detection was swifter, and the public was becoming more widely educated about how to stop its spread. Though the battle against AIDS would continue to the present day, it no longer meant a death sentence. But these changes came too late for many, including Derek Jarman, whose final film Blue was released in 1993. Having lost his sight in the final stages of his life, he could only now see the colour blue. The movie, which is a poetic soundscape of verse and prose, plays alongside an entirely blue screen and is considered by critics to be both his greatest work and the most definitive cinematic work to emerge from the era. Probably the most enduring and iconic movie made during the pandemic wasn't even a dramatisation of events. Documentary Paris is Burning captured the drag balls of New York City, in which the African American, Latino, gay and transgender communities are observed in their element, featuring footage of the balls and interviews with some of the key figures from the competing houses. Featuring figures of all races, genders and sexualities, this legendary movie would go on to shape the very bedrock of drag culture, having massive influence on RuPaul and today's Drag Race.
To be the mother of the house, you have to have the most power. Take a real family. It's the mother that's the hardest worker, and the mother gets the most respect. As far as my naming my house, the House of Ninja. Ninjas hit hard, they hit fast, an invisible assassin, and that's what we are. We come out to assassinate.
The House of LaBeija is the legendary house above all of them. I have the most members, I'm the most popular. New York City is wrapped up in being LaBeija.
For over a decade, the LGBT community had been buckling under the weight of the AIDS crisis, and this had been reflected on screen for over a decade. But in 1994, this started to change, as LGBT cinema started to go in two directions, the hard and the soft. The latter was sparked in 1994, when The Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert was released, a joyous and riotous irreverent queer classic that follows three drag queens as they cross the outback in a pink bus, affectionately named Priscilla. The film was packed with sass and one-liners, catapulted Guy Pearce and Hugo Weaving to stardom, and single-handedly changed the way LGBT people would be depicted on screen.
You actually make money by dressing up like a woman? Oh, sure. I can make a fine living in a pair of heels.
A year later, an American film that followed the exact same format followed Wesley Snipes, John Leguizamo and Patrick Swayze on a road trip across America in the movie To Wong Foo, Thanks for Everything Julie Newmar, which supposedly had developed in isolation from Priscilla, but I don't believe a word of it. And with that, the years of sadness came to an end when people realised that queer culture could be fun again. Rom-coms started to feature prominent gay characters. Four Weddings and a Funeral, My Best Friend's Wedding, The Object of My Affection, The Next Best Thing, and The Rules of Attraction all featured large gay roles, while some rom-coms were specifically made about gay people for gay people for the very first time. The Wedding Banquet, Billy's Hollywood Screen Kiss, Better Than Chocolate, The Broken Hearts Club, Kissing Jessica Stein, and even Eating Out saw the love lives of LGBT people being given the big screen treatment. The Birdcage saw Robin Williams and Nathan Lane recreate French classic La Cage aux Folles for an American audience, while But I'm a Cheerleader hilariously spoofed the gay conversion camps that had sprung up across America. Meanwhile, comedies were made that heavily depicted LGBT characters or themes, such as Mrs. Doubtfire, In and Out, Happy Texas, and, unfortunately, Boat Trip, which spends so much time mocking people that when it finally gets around to being tolerant, the damage is already done.
You want to get back together? Well, I did, before I found out that you were, How could you think I'm gay?
During this period, queer stories would also make their small screen debut too, with Tales of the City, Will and Grace, The L Word, and both the UK and American versions of Queer as Folk making waves on television for the first time. While the UK would go gaga for Kinky Boots on the big screen in 2005, a real queer breakthrough was for director John Cameron Mitchell with his off-Broadway musical Hedwig and the Angry Inch, which was adapted for the screen in 2000 and would see the writer and director turn actor and star in the big screen version of his play.
Ladies and gentlemen, whether you like it or not. Ow! Hedwig!
Following a universally ignored songwriter whose attempt to have gender reassignment surgery to escape communist East Germany was botched, but allowed her to come to the US and start to teach a young singer his craft, this rock musical has become an enduring cult hit. Mitchell would go on to become one of the biggest LGBT directors, and during this period, other queer filmmakers would rise to prominence.
When it comes to huge openings, a lot of people think of me.
After rising to prominence with Malanoche in 1986, American auteur Gus Van Sant was catapulted to stardom thanks to his queer reimagining of Shakespeare's history plays My Own Private Idaho. He would then go on to direct several big mainstream hits before returning to queer cinema in 2008 with his biopic of landmark gay politician Harvey Milk. The rise of American independent cinema in the early 90s saw the rise of the new queer cinema movement, the harder side of LGBT movies. Essentially allowing a film to have no clear genre, it incorporated films such as Chasing Amy, Head On, and Trick. And from this movement emerged director Greg Araki, a director whose movies are characterised by their distinct sensual assaults, from the gay road heist The Living End to the dysfunctional sexually diverse ensemble of Totally Fucked Up, and psychedelic sci-fi horror Nowhere to sex work drama Mysterious Skin. At the same time, punk subculture queercore was developing too. The movement harshly critiqued society and LGBT people's place within it, and from this cultural movement, Bruce LaBruce would rise to the fore, blending explicit pornography with a more traditional narrative in movies like Hustler White and The Raspberry Reich. He unabashedly tackles taboo topics such as fetish, rape, prostitution, and violence, often in quite disturbing ways. Where films about LGBT people had previously been fairly few and far between, suddenly there was a massive explosion in queer cinema. With too many to list, some of the highlights of this independent cinema explosion included lesbian movies like Go Fish, Bound, High Art, German movie Amy and Jaguar, and British My Summer of Love, which featured an impressive debut from Emily Blunt.
Apparently I'm a bad influence on people.
And David Lynch's Mulholland Drive, the trippy neo-noir mystery that revolves around the lesbian couple and is frequently cited now as one of the greatest movies of the 21st century.
Where's this going?
Mulholland Drive. It's been a very strange day.
Getting stranger.
Films that featured trans characters included Flawless, Before Night Falls, Breakfast on Pluto, and Spanish musical 20 Centimeters. Meanwhile, there were so many gay romance movies that in 2006, comedy movie Another Gay Movie would spoof what had decidedly become its own genre of cinema. Notable films of this period include Edge of 17, Get Real, Big Eden, Latter Days, and British tour de force Beautiful Thing, which depicted a teenage romance between two young men on a council estate.
Push him around in a little frilly hat. A big blue pram called Queen of the Road.
I think I'll have 2 of you and 10 of your mate. Hello.
Elsewhere in the world, many other countries were producing similar films too. Hong Kong movie Happy Together is cited as one of the most influential films of its period, while French Beau Travail, Close to Leo, and Mexican Y Tu Mama Tambien were big critical hits. But where many English language films were decidedly negative in tone in the way that they were depicting LGBT people, world cinema was a little bit more positive. Nowhere is this more evident than in the work of Spanish master director Pedro Almodovar. After his first movie Law of Desire saw him collaborate with Antonio Banderas for the first of 6 movie collaborations together, movies like Talk to Her and Bad Education all featured prominent gay storylines, while All About My Mother is probably the most acclaimed and enduring LGBT movie to be made in Spanish, and saw him collaborate in one of 5 movies with Penelope Cruz. Almodovar's movies saw him win 2 Oscars in the early noughties, and this wasn't the only time that the Academy Awards ventured toward rewarding LGBT movies or LGBT stories. Gods and Monsters, the story of gay horror director James Whale, was nominated for 3 Oscars, winning 1 of them. Hilary Swank won an Oscar in 1999 for her depiction of trans man Brandon Teena in Boys Don't Cry, while Charlize Theron also won for her depiction of lesbian serial killer Aileen Wuornos in Monster. Philip Seymour Hoffman would also win for his performance as the titular role in Capote, while The Hours and Far From Heaven received multiple nominations, and both feature lesbian and gay storylines respectively. But in all these films, LGBT characters were subjected to a whole host of negative and tragic circumstances. Similarly, gay history movies like Holocaust film Bent and biopic Wild saw the extremes of homophobia on film. For a while, it seemed like Hollywood didn't mind seeing the stories of LGBT people, as long as they suffered. But then, in 2005, two films arrived to buck that trend. Transamerica saw Felicity Huffman nominated for Best Actress as a trans woman who reconnects with her son in a road trip across America. But in the same year, the now iconic Brokeback Mountain was released. Made by Taiwanese director Ang Lee, the film is an adaptation of a short story by Annie Proulx and follows the love story between two sheep farmers who fall in love while isolated in the mountains together. While still tragic in its social exploration of gay men, what made it such a landmark film was that it unabashedly depicted two masculine men who fell desperately in love with each other. Jake Gyllenhaal and Heath Ledger's performances were widely acclaimed, and the film seemed poised to win the Best Picture prize, having swept all the precursors beforehand. But then, on the night, it wasn't meant to be. Ensemble race drama Crash scooped the prize, much to the horror of audiences and critics alike. And while the rest of the world had been ready to take the gay cowboy movie to its heart, the Hollywood elite was not. After a decade of LGBT cinema trying to both shock and placate audiences following the AIDS crisis, Brokeback Mountain was a real nodal point. Suddenly, someone somewhere realised that there was money to be made from telling the stories of queer people on screen. And they were a bit of an awards magnet too. The easiest first step was the biopic. A whole host of historical figures had just been waiting in the wings for the moment to be right, and, post-Brokeback, that moment was now. Artists, pioneers and heroes came under the spotlight, and the Hollywood A-list were all wanting their chance at Oscar glory. Lily Elbe, the first trans woman to undergo a sex change, was portrayed by Eddie Redmayne. Flamboyant but closeted piano superstar Liberace was portrayed by Michael Douglas, Oscar Wilde by Rupert Everett, Yves Saint Laurent by Gaspard Ulliel, Colette by Keira Knightley. Jared Leto and Matthew McConaughey both won Oscars for their roles in Dallas Buyers Club, which depicted the true story of a con artist who smuggled unapproved AIDS medication into the UK. Emma Stone played tennis icon Billie Jean King in Battle of the Sexes, while Rami Malek won an Oscar for playing Queen frontman Freddie Mercury in Bohemian Rhapsody. Melissa McCarthy played lesbian literary forger Lee Israel in Can You Ever Forgive Me? Meanwhile, World War II codebreaker Alan Turing was given the big screen treatment in The Imitation Game, with Benedict Cumberbatch Oscar nominated for his performance as the tortured genius whose sexuality was considered more important than his considerable achievements by authorities.
You've got more secrets than the best of them.
What if I don't fancy her in that way?
Can't tell anyone, Owen. It's illegal.
Political movies also found their place on screen in movies like Prayers for Bobby, The Normal Heart and Pride, a British film that depicts the true story of the unlikely alliance between a gay and lesbian group from London and a town of striking miners in 1980s rural Wales.
Di, your gays have arrived.
Don't meet everybody. Name the group you represent in this case.
Lesbians and gays support the miners.
When you're in a battle against an enemy so much bigger, so much stronger than you, but to find out you had a friend you never knew existed, well, that's the best feeling in the world.
What I was told about lesbians can't be true, can it? You're all vegetarians.
Probably the biggest LGBT history achievement in cinema came in the form of Milk, the biopic of the USA's first openly gay politician Harvey Milk, who explored his rise to power in San Francisco and subsequent assassination. The film saw Oscar nominations aplenty for its stars and director Gus Van Sant, with Sean Penn winning an Oscar for his performance in the titular role.
You all scared of girls.
You'll be the first openly gay man elected to major office.
It's like you're part of the machine now.
Society can't exist without the family.
We're not against that.
Can two men reproduce?
No, but God knows we keep trying.
Following the success of Milk, gay director Roland Emmerich's decision to make a movie about the Stonewall riots should have been a recipe for success, but unfortunately he made a major misfire. In deciding to portray the entire film through the eyes of a white, cisgender gay man, of whom there were very few involved, and even daring to change history and have him throw the first stones, which are widely known to have been thrown by 3 black drag queens, including trans legend Marsha P. Johnson, this whitewashing of queer history was universally panned by critics and the LGBT community alike, with the film becoming a universal failure. While we're still waiting for a gay, lesbian or transgender main character in a Hollywood blockbuster, bisexual women have taken centre stage in films like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and Atomic Blonde. Meanwhile, comedy is still struggling with LGBT depictions. You only have to watch the painfully offensive Bruno to see how ridiculing LGBT people hasn't yet become taboo. Since then, LGBT comedies like GBF and Hurricane Bianca have been very much geared toward niche gay audiences, with only I Love You Philip Morris managing to place gay characters front and centre in a mainstream comedy. However, 2018's Love, Simon saw the very first teen gay comedy arrive on the big screen. Following the tried and tested John Hughes-style formula, this heartwarming and genuinely funny feel-good rom-com brought a gay romantic lead to teenagers all over the world for the first time.
My name's Simon. For the most part, my life is totally normal. I have a family that I actually like, and there's my friends. We do everything friends do. We drink way too much iced coffee while gorging on carbs. So, I'm just like you, except I have one huge-ass secret.
Hey! I like your boots! I said I like your boots! Goodbye!
Nobody knows I'm gay.
But the rest of the world were actually streets ahead of Hollywood. Major LGBT releases had trickled out from all over the world, but nowhere was this more prevalent than in France. Lesbian romance Blue is the Warmest Colour won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, while AIDS drama 120 BPM won the Grand Prix 4 years later. The establishment of the Queer Palme also saw the festival awarding LGBT stories from all over the world, including French gay thriller Stranger by the Lake. Other widely acclaimed French LGBT releases include gender drama Tomboy, home invasion thriller Eastern Boys, real-time romance Theo and Hugo, theatrical biopic Reinventing Marvin, and sex work drama Sauvage. Elsewhere in Europe, Spain released trans musical 20 cm, Almodovar plastic surgery thriller The Skin I Live In, and lesbian erotic romance Room in Rome. LGBT sports people were explored in Polish competitive swimming romantic drama Floating Skyscrapers, and football in Swiss Mario and British The Pass. Gay teen coming-of-age stories were depicted in acclaimed movies One Kiss from Italy, Handsome Devil from Ireland, and North Sea Texas from Belgium. British Romance Weekend captured the hearts of countless moviegoers. Other major British successes included Postcards from London, Disobedience, and steamy sheep farming, yes, sheep farming, God's Own Country. Germany released trans teen romance Romeos, but also probably the most popular gay romance of all, Freefall, which follows two police officers who fall desperately in love with each other, despite one being already married to a woman.
So haben wir dich nicht erzogen, Marc.
Ich kann niemand richtig eifersüchtig sein!
Away from Europe, Brazil released XXY, The Way He Looks, and Taekwondo, while Chilean A Fantastic Woman became the first LGBT film to win Best Foreign Language Film at the Oscars. South African Beauty and The Wound were both widely acclaimed, while Kenyan Rafiki's success at international festivals forced its home country to temporarily change its laws on LGBT film releasing to give it eligibility for the Oscars. Australia released Holding the Man, South Korea The Handmaiden, and Israel Eyes Wide Open, In Between, as well as the progressive films of Eitan Fox, Walk on Water, The Bubble, and Yossi, all set in and around Tel Aviv. Another auteur to rise to the fore was French-Canadian director Xavier Dolan, whose first film, I Killed My Mother, catapulted him to stardom at the age of 20, which he wrote, directed, and starred in this semi-autobiographical account of his tempestuous relationship with his mother.
Hubert, si jamais ça va vraiment mal à la maison, tu peux venir habiter ici les fins de semaine.
Il me disait tout quand il était petit. Maintenant, je peux même plus ouvrir la bouche sans que si, sans que ça, c'est jamais correct, il y a toujours quelque chose.
Je pense que je suis faite pour pas avoir de mère.
Peut-être que ta mère est faite pour pas avoir de fils.
Subsequent movies, Heartbeat, Queer Palm winning Lawrence Anyways, my personal favourite, Tom of the Farm, and César Best Director winning It's Only the End of the World, have cemented the young Quebecois director as probably the strongest LGBT voice in cinema right now. Meanwhile in America, indie cinema created scores of LGBT releases, with many of them finding homes on streaming platforms like Netflix. Tangerine depicts a trans sex worker in a hilarious indie revenge comedy, which had all been shot on an iPhone. Other significant independent American releases have included Short Bus, Pariah, Albert Nobbs, Concussion, Love is Strange, Boy Meets Girl, Appropriate Behaviour, Freeheld, Other People, True Porn Thriller King Cobra, Closet Monster, Beach Rats, Gay Conversion Therapy Dramas I Am Michael, The Miseducation of Cumber & Post, and Boy Erased. 1985, and Beginners, which saw Christopher Plummer win an Oscar for playing a man who only discovers his sexuality after he has retired. And then, of course, are the big Oscar success stories. In Tom Ford's directorial debut, Colin Firth stars in A Single Man, about the last day in a gay man's life as he prepares himself to commit suicide. Annette Bening and Julianne Moore starred in The Kids Are Alright, a family drama in which a lesbian couple's children try to begin a relationship with their sperm donor father. Olivia Colman won an Oscar for playing British Queen Anne in Yorgos Lanthimos' comedic reimagining of her probably lesbian relationship with her two favourites at court, played by Rachel Weisz and Emma Stone.
My dear friend, how good to see you've returned from hell. I'm sure you shall pass through it one day.
Cate Blanchett and Rooney Mara were both nominated for their performances in luscious period romance Carol by Todd Haynes. Timothée Chalamet was catapulted to stardom after starring opposite Armie Hammer in Luca Guadagnino's Call Me By Your Name, a coming-of-age drama set in 1980s Italy about a young man who explores his sexuality with his academic father's hunky student protege.
Call me by your name and I'll call you by mine.
But the biggest success came from Barry Jenkins' Moonlight, an episodic drama that depicts 3 periods in a young gay man's life as he discovers, understands and explores his sexual identity. A subtle and beautiful commentary on what it means to be black, young and gay, the film surprised the film community by taking home the Best Picture prize in 2017, the very first LGBT picture to do so.
What you looking at me like that for? What, man? Come on, you just drove down here? Yeah.
With Moonlight proving that films that show queer stories could be both popular and recognised by their peers, the glass ceiling was permanently broken for LGBT stories on screen. 50 years exactly from the decriminalisation of homosexuality in the UK, and a gay film was recognised as the best movie of its year and given the highest accolade that Hollywood can bestow on one of its movies. And 2 years later, in 2019, 50 years exactly since the Stonewall riots, and 5 of the 8 Best Picture nominees feature at least one prominent LGBT character. And that brings to a close the Pink Lens's history of LGBT cinema. With movies coming from all over the world, the last 50 years have seen a whole wealth of LGBT content appearing on our screens. The work of Kenneth Anger, John Waters, Rainer Werner Fassbinder, Pier Paolo Pasolini, Gus Van Sant, Derek Jarman, Pedro Almodovar, Greg Araki, Bruce LaBruce, John Cameron Mitchell and Xavier Dolan have inspired generations of cinema goers. From the blackmailing of gay men in Victim in the 60s, we saw the depictions of a gay community in Boys of the Band in the 70s, which was counteracted by the public's gay panic in Cruising in the 1980s. The AIDS crisis saw fear and compassion alike in Philadelphia in the 90s, before the joy of campness overshadowed this in The Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. Brokeback Mountain brought LGBT romance to multiplex cinemas in the noughties, with Carol and Call Me By Your Name hot on its heels. Milk and Pride brought LGBT politics to the big screen, and Moonlight finally went the distance, the first LGBT movie to triumph at the Oscars. What will happen over the next few years with LGBT cinema? Well, whatever it is, the Pink Lens will be with you, so make sure that you visit www.thepinklens.com for all your news, reviews and features about LGBT cinema. Thanks for watching, and until next time folks.